Alright, so in the last video, I made a video player that you could use for the Unity setup or the AV Pro setup. Now we want to be able to control it in-game a bit, give you a pause play button to let you set the volume of the audio sources, and allow you to change the URL in-game. We won't be going over networking or syncing anything this time, but I'll be going into that more in the next video. Right now, we need to set up the buttons that we're going to be using for our video player. So as a child of this, I'm going to go in here, right click, create UI, and canvas. This is just going to be where we're going to hold all of our UI elements. And right now it's really big and overlays to the screen. So we need to change that from render mode screen space overlay to world space. And now it's a physical object in our scene that we can move. And I'm just going to move this to 0 to 0.7. That puts it about right where we need it. Now, it's really big, so I'm going to scale it down to 0.001. And let's do 1920 times 2 by 1080. This is just going to be the space that we can take up by having our canvas here. Now, in order for us to be able to interact with it, we'll go to Add Component and search UI Shape. VRC UI Shape. Now you can interact with it in game. So let's start putting our buttons down in here. Our first button is UI button, and this is going to be button underscore play pause. So if the video is playing and you press this button, it will pause it. If the video is paused and you press this button, it will play. Let's first make this a bit bigger. Let's do times 2, 320. Let's do that one there as well. And let's make the text a bit more visible as well. Play/pause. And we'll bump that up to, yeah, I'd say 90 is good. Now we want this button to be able to reference the Udon behavior that we're going to do all of our scripting on. And right now I have my video player on my CD player right here. So I'm just going to put an Udon behavior on it right here. And for now, I'm not going to make any scripts. I'll show that in a second, but we just need to be able to reference this Udon behavior from this button. Oh, and make sure to set navigation to be none on any UI elements that you have. Otherwise, if you run towards a slider, it will go up, and there's different dumb things like that. So we're going to use this onClick event right here. So just plus to make another option. We'll drag our Udon behavior object onto this, my CD player. And in function, you want to go down the drop down to Udon behavior. And then I have a 4K monitor, so it's visible, but you might need to scroll down to find send custom event string. And this is going to be how we call the play pause event that we're going to make inside of the video player. And I'm just going to call it play pause. All right, so that is it for the first button. Let's make our volume slider now. So I'll go into the canvas, right click, UI slider. I'll just drag it out here, and let's scale this up a little bit. Let's do times 4. Yeah, 4 is good. Times 4 as well. Now you'll see that this has stretched our circle here a little bit. So I'm going to copy the height of this object and go into the handle slide area, handle, and set that to be the width. And that allows it to match it perfectly. So let's go up to our slider, and I'm going to rename this to slider volume. Once again, we'll set navigation to be none, and on value changed, meaning when this is slid up and down, you can adjust that with this value right here. When this is changed at all, it will send this event. So we'll do the same thing as before, put my CD player in here, Udon behavior, send custom event, and I'm going to say set volume. Again, these are all events that we will make later. As a note, my audio sources are going to be at 1 by default, so our slider should also be at 1 by default so that it doesn't look weird. Now let's make a way so that you can input a URL for your video. So we'll go into Canvas, right click again, do UI, and do input field. Now I'll drag this over here, and let's scale this one up as well. Let's do times 6. There we go. 30 times 6. Now let's just do 100 on this. Now you see the text is quite small again, so we'll change those to be a bit bigger. I'm also going to center it vertically so that it's a bit more spaced correctly. So for security reasons, we actually can't use an input field. We need to use a URL input field. These components are almost identical in every way, except one has a very restricted string that you can use that's called a URL. So we'll get rid of our input field right here, remove component, and we'll do URL input field. Once again, set navigation to be none, and you'll see here there's a text component. We can just drag the text from our old one in here, and that lights up the rest, and we can put placeholder into the placeholder spot. Now there's a couple ways that you can set a URL. First, you can do it when you're done editing this box here, so that when you hit enter or escape, it'll automatically send it out. And you would just do that by doing it in an event here. Now, I've found that I personally accidentally type things a lot when I'm putting in a URL, and I don't want it to instantly try to load in a bad URL. So instead of using on and edit, I'm instead going to have a second button right next to this that says load. So I'm going to duplicate this object, move it over here. I'll shrink it down to 200 by 100, bring it over a bit, and I'm instead going to have this be button load URL. I'm going to copy that name and have that be the event. I'll also change the text to say load, and I'll drop the size a bit. And there we go. This will be the button that loads the URL. So now we can start actually making the Udon graph that we're going to be using to control this. So in my scripts folder, I'm just going to right click, create VRChat UdonGraph program asset, and I'm just going to call this video controller. Now on the CD player, I'll just put that into the slot, and we can open UdonGraph. Now we need to set up a couple variables so that we can access the different things we have here. So first of all, we need a video player, which is a base VRC video player. I'll just double click that to rename it to video player. And we're going to have this be a private variable so that we can set it in the graph instead of in the inspector and just save some space over here. Next, we're going to need a reference to our audio sources so that we can set the volume for them. Audio source. Now we'll want this to be an array because I'm using multiple ones. You can just use the normal one as well and bypass the looping setup I do later if you only have one audio source. But I'm going to have two, so I'm going to use the array. And I'm just going to call this speakers and set that to be public. Next, we'll need a slider to determine the volume. So we'll do plus slider, and I'll call this slider volume, and we'll set that to be public as well. And finally, we'll need a reference to our input field so that we can figure out what URL we have typed in. So I'll do input field, and we'll see VRC URL input field. And I'll just do URL field and set that to be public as well. Now we can go to our inspector, and I'm going to set 2 for the speaker array so I can put my 2 audio sources into these spots. Then we'll put our slider volume in there, and lastly a reference for our input field. So now on start, we want to be able to say, oh, the video player is the video player component from the active object that this script is on. So I'm going to do space start to get event start, and we will do control drag from video player to get a set variable component. Just connect those, and then we want to be able to get a value for this. So we'll reference the transform that this is on and say get component. So I'm going to search transform, get component, just connect component into there, and I'll drag out from type and search video player. Now the type name is a bit annoying at the moment because it is VRC SDK3 video components base VRC video player, which will probably be shortened in the future, but we'll see. But right now, this looks at the present game object and gets the video player component if one exists, which we have it right here. Now I'm using the AV Pro video player. Scripting for both the AV Pro one and the Unity one is identical, so you can use either system you prefer. All right, now we're going to set up our play pause button. So I have the event named PlayPause. So we're going to do a custom event and just call this PlayPause. Now in PlayPause, we want to know if it's already playing or if it's paused. So we'll get a reference to our video player, drag out and say is playing. Now this will give you a true or false as to whether or not it is playing. So we can drag out from here and get a branch so that we can tell whether or not it's true or false. So if it is playing, we want the video player to pause. So we'll grab our reference again and say pause. And I'll just put this up here and we'll connect that to true. But if we want it to play because it's paused, we'll do play. Now the word play is in player, so all of these still show up, but nearer to the bottom you'll find play. So we can just click that, drag it here, and connect that to false. So for the next one, we'll set up our volume slider. Now we have it called SetVolume, so I'll do a custom event and I'll call that SetVolume. Now, since I have multiple audio sources, I'll have to go through each one of those individually so that I can set all of their volume. If you just have one, you can skip what I'm about to do, but I'm going to set up a for loop so that I can go through them all. I'm going to search for, and this is just going to be used to iterate through everything. I believe I've mentioned these before, but we have a lot of new viewers now that the video players are out, so I'll explain them again. Basically, this will go through a list and do things end amount of times. So let's say I have 10. It starts at 0 and says, if this number is below this number, well, go up by the value of step, and then call the event that's out of body. Now, you can do this, so if it's just this setup, body will be called 10 times every time that this event is called. But I'm going to get the exact length of the audio source array that I have, so I know all the speakers I have. So get speakers, drag out, and do length. Now, there's 4 different options. You just want the first one, get space length, and then drag that int into end. And then we'll leave it so step is 1 and it iterates up by that. So every time it goes up by one audio source, we want to be able to set that audio source to have the correct volume. So we'll get a reference to our speakers again, but we need a reference to a very specific speaker in this list. So we'll do get, which is capital G right at the top, and this will allow you to get a certain one in this list. So if we go through here, you'll see I have the first one is 0 and the second one is 1. We can reference that by getting index right here. Now, index gives you the value of what this current number we're counting by is. So we can just drag that into this spot, and we'll say audio source set volume, and we'll just connect that out of body, and that will set the volume. Presently it's setting it to 0 though, so we need to get the value of our slider. So we'll drag out from our slider, we'll say get value right at the bottom, and then we'll connect this float into value right here. All right, now we're playing and pausing, we can set the volume. Now we need to be able to set the URL from the input field we have. So I have that being called from the button, and that's LoadURL. So we'll have another custom event, and that will be called LoadURL. Now, when you start loading a URL, it takes a couple seconds for it to fully load. So first we need to tell it that if there's presently a video playing, just stop. We don't want to have a video still playing as it's trying to load another one. So we'll just say stop on our video player and call that immediately in this event. Next, we're going to drag out our video player again and say load URL, and we'll connect those together, but we need to tell it what URL to get. So we'll get a reference from our URL field and drag out, and we'll do get URL, one word. If you search get space URL, it will not show up, so just do get URL. And then we'll grab this and connect that into our URL spot right there. So whenever this event is called, it will load the URL that it's ready with. However, we want to tell it to play as soon as the video is ready, so we need to actually wait a moment for it to load, and then we can tell it to play. Fortunately, VRChat gives us an exact event on when that happens, so we can just do OnVideoReady. So as soon as a new video has been loaded through the URL, we can tell it to play. So we'll get our video player, drag out, and search play, and just go all the way down and find it here. Connect that up, and there you have it. This is our video player controller. We have playing, pausing, we have volume setting, we have loading URL, and we have playing as soon as it's loaded. Compile, reload, I'll head out, and let's test this out in game. All right, so I have it auto playing a video here. We're just gonna drag the volume down so it's quieter. There we go. So you see that works. We can drag up and down to change that or entirely mute it. Drag up a little bit and it's still going. We'll hit play and it pauses it. You'll see it's no longer moving the grass around. And it works like that. Now we'll go grab a different URL for a different video. Just put it in here, enter, and then we can press load and it loads the new video. Perfect. All right, so that's the video player done in the graph. Now I'm going to go recreate it in UdonSharp as well, so that we can have it in a scripted format instead of graph as well, for those who want that. Now for video players, I'm personally going to be using Visual Studio 2019 instead of Visual Studio Code, because Visual Studio itself has a lot more native ability to import libraries that the video players will need. If you don't have that installed, you can download it from a link below, and once it's installed, you can go to Preferences, Editor Tools, and swap your external script editor to be Visual Studio 2019. So I'm going to go into Scripts folder, right click, Create USharp Script, and I'm going to call this Video Controller Sharp. So that's a different name from the graph I have. You'll get an error saying that it couldn't find itself. Ignore that. That will happen every time you make a new script. Now I'm going to swap out the program source with the new one that I've made. We'll just put it there, and it'll change it to a more compact one for UdonSharp. We can double click our C# script and open it up in Visual Studio. Now to reference what we did in the graph, I'll have that open to the side so that we can reference what we did there and how we are essentially recreating it directly in UdonSharp. So to start out with, we need our video player, speaker, slider, and URL field variables. Above start, we'll do private base VRC video player. We'll hit enter, and that imports VRC SDK 3 video components base as a library. If you're still using Visual Studio Code, you'll have to manually import this above here so that you can have access to the video player libraries. I'll call this video player. I'll go down and make my speakers. So public audio source, and then I'll put brackets at the end to make it an array and call that speakers. Next, we need our slider. So we'll do public slider. Make sure you do the one that says unityengine.ui, and that will import the unityengine.ui library. So we'll call that slider volume. And lastly, we'll need our URL field. So we'll do a public VRC URL input field and call that URL field. Make sure you have a VRC URL input field instead of just a normal VRC URL field. They're two different things, and only this one will work. Now in start, let's set our video player to be the right component. So video player equals get component, and then in here we do type of base VRC video player. Now we have to cast this as a video player as well. So before it, we do base VRC video player in parentheses. This is because this specific component is a VRChat component. If we were to do, say, a slider instead, which is a Unity component, we would just be able to do, let's say, slider volume equals get component, and then in here we'd say slider and parentheses and end. And that would be all we need. However, for VRChat components, we have to cast and call which specific component it is in order for it to be set up correctly. So we'll start with our PlayPause event. So we'll have a public void PlayPause, parentheses, we'll say if video player.isPlaying. So this is actually all we need. We can say equals true, but this statement is redundant as just having video player.isPlaying in these parentheses gives you a true or false statement. So while it's playing, we want to pause it. So we'll do video player.pause, and that's a function, so we'll call it with parentheses. And if it's not playing, so else, we will do video player.play. So that's our pause event. So let's go into our setting volume. We'll have a public void set volume. And now here's where we build our for loop. So we do for parentheses, and now we need to have an int that we iterate through. So we'll say int I just to iterate and establish that as equaling 0. Now, while I is less than speakers.length, so basically while this number that we have is lower than the amount of speakers we have, semicolon, now we add to I each time we iterate through this loop. Now you could do I equals I plus 1. You could do I plus equals 1, or you can have it shortened down to I plus plus, and that's what I'll be doing. Now in here, we'll do exactly the same as we did over here. So we'll do speakers, and we'll reference I in here. Normally you would reference 0, 1, or 2 to get a certain one, and we'd reference that with I dot volume equals slider volume dot value. Now this gets the value of the slider and puts that as the volume of the speaker. And this will go through each speaker we have and do the same thing. Now in UdonSharp, we also have access to a ForEach loop, which is a bit cleaner to write, but in the back end just gets turned into a for loop as well. So if you want to do that instead, we would do ForEach, then we just do var for a new variable, and I'll call this source for the different audio sources. This is just an arbitrary name, in speakers. Now for every variable that's inside of speakers, and source gets set to be an audio source because it can detect what type of variable this is, we can do source.volume equals slider volume dot value. This is just a cleaner way to type this, but I will be using the for loop instead, not because one runs better than the other or anything, but this one is more identical to the graph, and I'll just keep it synonymous between the two. Now let's load the URL that we're using. So we'll do public void load URL, and we'll tell the video player to stop. So video player dot stop parentheses. Now we'll load the URL. So video player dot load URL, and in parentheses, we'll tell it what URL to load. So we'll do URL field dot get URL. That's a function as well. So parentheses, and end the line with the semicolon. That's the entire load URL event. So we'll finish off by just telling it to play as soon as a video is ready. Since this event already exists in Udon for VRChat, we need to override the event. You don't technically need to, but it autofills a lot better when you do that, and it's just better practice. So we'll do public override, and you'll start with OnVideoReady. So you'll see it down here. I'll just arrow down, and it autofills the rest of the event. So public override void OnVideoReady. This just calls the normal OnVideoReady event, which we can ignore, and we'll just delete this, and we'll just say video player dot play, so that it plays as soon as the video is ready. And that should be it for our script. So I'll go back into Unity after saving, and we'll set this up as soon as everything is done compiling. Go into our scene. We have all of our UI events, our audio sources. So let's go to the canvas to make sure nothing changed. Everything is still set up correctly here. And we'll go into VRChat and make sure it works. All right, the video is auto playing, so I'll drag their volume down. There we go. Pause and play still works. And we'll load the URL. And there we go. We have all the functions back again. All right, thanks for sticking with me. This has been a bit of a longer one. In the next video, I'll be focusing on syncing so that different people can load a video. They can play and pause it. You'll probably want to keep the volume slider local, but we also want the video to be able to catch up for anyone who is joining an instance late. So all of that will be in my next video. In the meantime, I have a Discord now. People kept asking for it, so now one of those exists. If you want access to any of the assets I use in this video, they'll be available on my Patreon. And if you have any requests, recommendations, or anything else you want to say, just toss in the comments section or on the Discord now that I have that. And I'll see you guys next time.